The air war over Europe in the final years of World War II presented a stark and terrifying paradox. By day, the relentless formations of American B-17 flying fortresses droned through flak-filled skies, and by night, the relentless stream of British Lancasters burned German cities. The once mighty Luftwaffe was being bled white, its pilot corps decimated, its air superiority shattered. Yet, in the midst of this strategic collapse, German engineers were preparing a revolution that threatened to overturn the entire paradigm of aerial combat. From the secretive design bureaus and hidden factories of the Third Reich emerged aircraft that belonged to the future, the world's first operational jet fighters. This was not merely an incremental improvement, it was a quantum leap, a fundamental reimagining of flight that severed the link between the propeller and the sky, promising speeds and climb rates that piston-engined aircraft could not hope to match. The genesis of this revolution lay in the theoretical work of pioneers like Hans von Ohain, who successfully ran the first operational turbojet engine, the Hes-1, in 1937. While other nations experimented with jet propulsion, it was in Germany that the technology was pursued with relentless, desperate urgency. The result was the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, Swallow. To an Allied pilot accustomed to the familiar shapes of Spitfires, Mustangs, and Thunderbolts, the Me-262 was an apparition from another world. It was a sleek, shark-like aircraft, its wings swept back not for aesthetic effect but as a necessary concession to the transonic airflow its Junkers Jumo 00 for turbojets could produce. Its most defining feature was its absence, no propeller. This lack alone made it alien, a machine that seemed to defy the established principles of flight. The performance figures were as shocking as its appearance. The Me-262 could achieve a maximum speed of 540 miles per hour, nearly 120 miles per hour faster than the superlative North American P-51 Mustang. Its rate of climb was staggering, allowing it to intercept high-flying bomber streams with an ease that piston-engined interceptors could only dream of. Armed with 30 million Malawian Kwarchers 108 cannons, it possessed a battery of firepower so devastating that a brief, 1-second burst was calculated to be enough to destroy a heavy bomber. When it entered combat in the summer of 1944, the effect was traumatic. Allied bomber crews, who had developed a grim calculus for surviving attacks from FW-190s and Bf-109s, watched in disbelief as these silver slashes tore through their formations with impunity. They moved too fast to be effectively targeted by defensive machine guns. Escort fighters found themselves helpless, able only to dive on the jets as they landed, their only moment of vulnerability. Simultaneously, another, even more radical aircraft took to the skies, the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet. If the Me-262 was a leap forward, the Comet was a lunge into the fantastical. A rocket-powered interceptor, it was not so much flown as it was aimed. Powered by a highly volatile combination of two substances known as T-Stoff and C-Stoff, essentially rocket propellants that were hypergolic, meaning they ignited on contact with each other, the Comet could climb to 30,000 feet in under 2.5 minutes. This was a vertical performance that felt supernatural. It would ascend like a projectile, make a single, lightning-fast pass through a bomber formation, and then glide back to Earth, a powerless and vulnerable glider. Its very existence was a testament to German engineering audacity, a weapon of breathtaking, almost suicidal, intensity. This jet revolution, however, was born with a fatal congenital flaw. The very desperation that fueled its creation also ensured its ultimate failure. The Jumo 00 for engines of the Me-262, while revolutionary, were notoriously unreliable. Constructed with strategic materials in critically short supply, they used substitute metals that could not withstand the extreme heat and stress for long. The mean time between failures was a mere 10 to 25 hours. The engines were also throttle sensitive, prone to flaming out if accelerated too quickly and susceptible to compressor stalls. For novice pilots, transitioning from the forgiving torque of a piston engine to the raw, temperamental power of a jet was a deadly challenge. Furthermore, the political leadership of the Third Reich, particularly Adolf Hitler, fatally misjudged the weapon's purpose. Enraptured by its speed, he demanded it be used not as an interceptor to save German cities, but as a blitz bomber, a fast bomber to harass the Allied ground advance. This disastrous tactical diversion wasted precious months and subjected the delicate airframes to stresses they were not designed for, further delaying and diluting their impact as defensive fighters. The Comet was an even more extreme case. Its rocket fuel was so corrosive and explosive that more airframes were lost in accidents and landing crashes than to enemy action. It was a spectacular, but ultimately useless, technical dead end. Thus, the German jet revolution presented the most profound what-if of the air war. It was a dazzling display of technical ingenuity, a true dawn of a new era that pointed unequivocally to the future of aviation. Yet, it was a dawn that broke over a kingdom already in ashes, a revolution hamstrung by the very regime that spawned it. The Me-262 and Me-163 were terrifying portents, but they were not war winners. They were the brilliant, flawed, and tragic vanguard of a new age, arriving just in time to be swept into the dustbin of history, even as their legacy would define the conflicts of the next half-century. The first encounters between the Messerschmitt Me-262 and Allied air formations were less like combat and more like a demonstration of a new physical law. For pilots who had spent years honing their skills in the brutal, energy-managed duels of piston-engined aircraft, the jet's appearance was a violation of reality. The initial reports filtering back to Allied intelligence were met with disbelief, dismissed as the exaggerated fantasies of stressed-out airmen. But the grim, consistent details soon coalesced into an undeniable and terrifying truth: the Luftwaffe, though on its back foot, had unleashed a weapon that rendered the Allies' entire air superiority obsolete. The dominance of the Me-262 in its early operational months was absolute and rooted in performance characteristics that defied countertactics. A typical engagement unfolded with a chilling, repetitive script. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses, cruising at 25,000 feet, would be alerted by a trailing mosquito or a sharp-eyed tail gunner. The warning would be vague: bogies, high and fast, 6 o'clock. There was no time for a detailed description. By the time the gunners swung their .50 caliber Brownings toward the rear, the bogies had transformed into silver blurs, growing from specks to identifiable shapes with impossible speed. They closed at a rate of over 100 feet per second, a closure speed so high it negated the lead calculations for the bombers' crosshairs. The gunners would open fire, hosing the sky with tracers, but their aim was invariably behind the target. The jets were already where the bullets were not. The Schwalbe would then tear through the bomber box like a predator through a school of fish. Its 430 million Malawian Kwarters 108 cannons would bark with a sound described as a deep, hollow ripping of canvas. The effect was not merely destructive, it was apocalyptic. A single 30mm high explosive shell could sever a wing spar or eviscerate a fuselage. A 1-second burst would fire a dozen of these shells, a concentration of firepower that could vaporize a B-17. The bombers would shudder and disintegrate, their crews having no time to even don their parachutes. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, the jets would be gone, their momentum carrying them miles ahead of the formation in a matter of seconds. They did not turn to engage in a dogfight, they simply vanished, leaving only contrails, confusion, and burning wreckage in their wake. For the P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt pilots tasked with escort duty, the experience was one of profound frustration and helplessness. They possessed the best piston-engined fighters in the world, but they were flying in a different era. A pilot who spotted a Me-262 and nosed over into a dive to intercept would find the jet effortlessly pulling away. The only conceivable window of attack was during the jet's landing approach, when it was slow, low on fuel, and vulnerable. Even then, it was a dangerous game. The Me-262 was still fast, and its pilots were under strict orders to land in elements of 2 or more, providing mutual cover. Catching one required perfect timing and immense luck. This unassailable performance bred a specific kind of arrogance in the early Me-262 pilots, an elite cadre within the newly formed Kommando Nauertni. They were the chosen few, the knights of the new age, flying a machine that made their enemies look like they were standing still. They developed a contempt for their slow-flying, Allied fighters. Their tactics were simple and brutally effective: use their staggering climb rate to altitude, make 1 or 2 slashing, hit-and-run attacks on the bomber stream from the rear, and then use their superior speed to disengage, diving away from any would-be pursuers. They felt untouchable. In their cockpits, encased in the roar of their jets, they operated with the confidence of men who knew the rules of the game had been rewritten in their favor. A pilot from the famed JG-7 Nauertny later recalled the sensation: "You would see the Amos, Americans, below you, their contrails so slow and lazy. You would pick your target, dive, and in seconds you were among them. It was like driving a racing car through a parade of farm tractors. You could see their tracers curling behind you, always too late. By the time they could react, you were already a speck on the horizon. There was no fight. It was an execution." This period of early dominance was brief, lasting from its initial combat trials in the late summer of 1944 through the autumn. But its psychological impact was lasting and profound. For the Allies, it created a crisis of confidence. The air campaign, the cornerstone of the strategy to defeat Germany, was suddenly threatened by a handful of these revolutionary aircraft. The bomber crews, who had already endured the hell of flak and conventional fighters, now faced a threat against which they had no viable defense. The very concept of the strategic bomber offensive was called into question. The arrogance of the Mi-262 pilots was a product of their machine's sheer, unanswerable superiority. They ruled the high-speed regime of the sky, a domain where no Allied aircraft could follow. It was a terrifying glimpse into a future where quality, in its most extreme form, could potentially overwhelm quantity. But this arrogance, born of technological supremacy, was also its greatest vulnerability. It bred tactical rigidity and a dangerous underestimation of an enemy who was already desperately searching for a way to clip the Swallow's wings. In the shadow of the German jet revolution, the North American P-51 Mustang represented a different kind of genius, not a quantum leap, but the perfection of an existing paradigm. It was an underdog not in performance, for it was arguably the finest piston-engine fighter of the war, but in its origins and its intended role. It was a machine born of a British request, initially overlooked by its own countrymen, and transformed from a competent low-altitude reconnaissance aircraft into the very weapon that would tame the skies over Europe and, ultimately, help checkmate the technological terror of the Mi-262. The Mustang's genesis was anything but preordained. In 1940, with Britain desperate for modern fighters, the Royal Air Force Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation to license build the P-40. North American's president, Dutch Kindleberger, counterproposed a bold alternative: his company could design and deliver a superior fighter in the same time frame. The result, the NA-73X, was a masterpiece of aerodynamic cleanliness from its first drawing. Its chief designer, Edgar Schmude, a German-born émigré, incorporated a revolutionary laminar-flow wing, which reduced drag and provided an exceptionally efficient, high-lift platform. It was sleek, rakish, and powered by the reliable, but medium-altitude, Allison V1710 engine. In this initial guise, as the Mustang MKI for the RAF, it was a superb low-level fighter and ground attack aircraft, but its performance fell off sharply above 15,000 feet, rendering it useless for the high-altitude bomber escort mission that would define the air war in Europe. The transformation of the Mustang from a talented specialist to a legendary war winner is one of the great turning points of the war, born from a simple yet profound act of cross-pollination. In Britain, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronnie Harker examined the airframe and recognized its latent potential. He famously noted that the Mustang was a bloody good airframe waiting for a bloody good engine. That engine was the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the powerplant that propelled the Spitfire and the Lancaster. The marriage was one of mechanical destiny. The Packard Motor Company in the US began license building the Merlin, and in 1942, the P-51B was born, featuring the two-stage, two-speed supercharged Packard V1650-3 Merlin engine. The effect was transformative. The Merlin unlocked the Mustang's true potential, endowing it with breathtaking high-altitude performance. Its supercharger forced dense air into the engine, allowing it to develop immense power well over 30,000 feet. Now, the Mustang was not just fast, it was supremely fast where it mattered most, in the thin, cold air where the B-17s flew. Its range was its other superpower. By incorporating a sleek, 85-gallon fuselage fuel tank behind the pilot, which critically shifted the center of gravity and initially made the aircraft tricky to handle, and by utilizing underlying drop tanks, the P-51D could fly over 1,600 miles. For the first time, American bombers had a fighter that could fly with them all the way to Berlin and back, engaging in combat with energy to spare. This combination of range, speed, and high-altitude agility made the Mustang the definitive guardian of the bomber streams. When it arrived in large numbers in early 1944, it changed the air war overnight. The Luftwaffe's defensive fighters, which had been savaging unescorted bombers, now found themselves hunted and destroyed by the long-range Mustangs. The Mustang pilots, flying their elegant, nimble mounts, possessed the initiative. They could prowl ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies of the German interceptors before they could even form up for their attacks. It was in this role as the defender of the Rice airspace that the Mustang, the pinnacle of piston engine technology, found itself facing its greatest challenge, the Me-262. On paper, it was a hopeless mismatch. The jet was 100 miles per hour faster. In a straight-line chase, the Mustang was powerless. But air combat is rarely about paper statistics, it is about tactics, positioning, and exploiting an enemy's weaknesses. The Mustang pilots, though flying an inferior machine, held several critical advantages. First was situational awareness. The P-51, operating in large numbers high over Germany, often saw the Me-262s first. They watched them climb from their bases, their distinctive twin smoke trails painting a path across the sky. This allowed the Mustang pilots to position themselves with the ultimate tactical advantage, altitude. Second was the Me-262's vulnerability. The jet's Achilles heels were its slow acceleration, particularly during takeoff and landing, and the fragility of its engines. A Mustang pilot could not catch a jet in level flight, but he could ambush one. The standard tactic became the rat scramble. Mustang squadrons would loiter near known Me-262 airfields, such as Lechfeld and Parchim. When a jet was spotted taking off or, even better, lining up for its final approach, low, slow, and out of fuel, the Mustangs would pounce. In this regime, the P-51's superb low-speed maneuverability and devastating armament of 6.50 caliber machine guns made it a lethal executioner. The jet pilot, struggling with his temperamental engines and a narrow landing gear, was a sitting duck. Third was numerical and logistical superiority. While the Luftwaffe struggled to field a few hundred jets, plagued by fuel shortages, bombing raids, and engine shortages, thousands of Mustangs poured off American production lines. For every Me-262, there were a dozen P-51s. They could afford to wait, to patrol, to absorb losses. The German jet pilots could not. Thus, the P-51 Mustang, the unlikely underdog that began life as a British stopgap, became the perfect foil to the high-tech German wonder weapon. It did not defeat the Me-262 in a fair fight, it made the fight unfair. It used its strategic strengths, range and numbers, to negate the jet's tactical advantage of speed. The Mustang proved that in total war, the perfect system, a reliable, capable, and massively produced aircraft integrated into a superior strategy, could, and would, triumph over a brilliant but fragile technological marvel. It was the steady, relentless anvil against which the Nazi jet revolution was ultimately broken. The initial shock of encountering the Me-262 was a visceral, disorienting experience for Allied pilots. The first reports read like science fiction: enemy aircraft with no propellers, closing speeds over 500 miles per hour, impossible to track with gun sights. For a brief, terrifying period in late 1944, the jet was a phantom, a predator that struck from a domain of speed that was inaccessible to them. But the pilots of the USAAF were not just combatants, they were professional killers, and their survival depended on a cold, analytical dissection of this new threat. The era of war was quickly supplanted by an intense, collaborative campaign of observation, analysis, and tactical innovation. The hunter was being studied, and its weaknesses were about to be exposed. The process began in debriefing tents and officers' clubs across England and France. Pilots who had survived an encounter with their jet job or their blow job, a crude reference to its jet exhaust, were debriefed with an intensity usually reserved for intelligence coups. Every detail was scrutinized. What was its profile? How did it climb? How did it turn? Crucially, what was it doing when it was most vulnerable? The collective intelligence began to paint a picture that was far less invincible than the silver blur suggested. The first and most critical weakness identified was the Mi-262's performance at low speed. While its top speed was untouchable, pilots noted that it seemed sluggish during takeoff and landing. A P-47 pilot from the 56th Fighter Group reported seeing one struggling to gain airspeed after liftoff, wallowing like a pregnant duck as its pilot fought to get the temperamental Jumo engines into their efficient power band. This was the chink in the armor. The jet's engines had poor throttle response and were slow to spool up. From a standing start or a low-energy state, it was profoundly vulnerable. Furthermore, pilots noted the Mi-262's poor maneuverability at high speeds. A P-51 pilot who had managed to get a fleeting deflection shot reported that the jet did not turn, it lumbered. Its controls became extremely heavy as it approached its maximum velocity, a phenomenon known as compressibility. In a high-speed turning fight, the nimble Mustang and Thunderbolt could actually outturn the jet, though they could never hope to catch it if it chose to disengage by flying straight and level. The key was to force the jet into a maneuver, to rob it of its straight-line speed advantage. The most valuable intelligence, however, came from studying the jet's combat tactics. The early Mi-262 pilots, confident in their speed, had become predictable. Their standard attack was a stern conversion on the bomber stream. They would dive from above and behind, make their firing pass, and then continue their dive to build up even more speed before climbing away for another pass. This was a linear, energy-efficient tactic, but it was also a pattern. American fighter pilots, particularly those flying top cover for the bombers, learned to anticipate this. They began positioning themselves not just alongside the bombers, but high above them, plinking, as they called it, waiting for the silver flashes of the climbing or diving jets. One of the most effective analysts was Lieutenant Colonel John C. Yeager, a legendary P-51 ace and commander of the 487th Fighter Squadron. He meticulously compiled data from his pilots' encounters and distilled them into a set of tactical doctrines. He emphasized the concept of the bounce. Since you could not chase a jet, you had to ambush it. This meant using altitude to convert into speed, diving on the Mi-262 before its pilot could react and accelerate away. Yeager also stressed attacking the jet in a shallow dive, as a steep dive would allow the Mi-262 to simply roll and dive away even more effectively. The ultimate vulnerability, and the one that American pilots ruthlessly exploited, was the jet's need to return to base. The Mi-262 had a notoriously short endurance, less than an hour. Knowing this, the Americans began a campaign of field circling. Squadrons of P-51s would loiter near known Mi-262 airfields, staying high and out of range of flak. They would watch the airfield traffic, waiting for a jet to take off or, even better, to return from a mission, low on fuel and hydraulic pressure, with its wheels and flaps down for landing. In this state, the magnificent jet was at its most helpless. It was slow, heavy, and its pilot's attention was divided between his instruments, the runway, and the sky. A diving pass from a flight of Mustangs at this moment was almost always fatal. The German pilots referred to these predatory American fighters as Yeager, hunters, during this vulnerable phase, a bitter irony that the hunters were now the hunted. The analysis also extended to the jet's armament. While the 30mm cannons were devastating, pilots noted they had a low muzzle velocity and a steep trajectory. This made them ideal for demolishing slow-moving bombers from close range, but less effective against small, maneuvering fighters. A sharp turn could throw off the jet pilot's aim. The American .50 caliber machine guns, while requiring more hits to achieve a kill, had a flatter trajectory and higher rate of fire, making them better for tracking a fast-moving, but briefly presented, target. This collective learning curve, this rapid dissemination of hard-won knowledge, was a testament to the flexibility and professionalism of the USAAF. They had turned an existential threat into a manageable, if still extremely dangerous, problem. They learned to respect the Mi-262's strengths but to despise its weaknesses. They developed a new kind of air combat, one based not on dogfighting, but on interception, ambush, and the exploitation of logistical and mechanical frailties. The American pilot, flying his obsolete piston engine fighter, had learned to hunt the hunter. He had figured out that the key to killing a machine from the future was to attack it when it was most firmly rooted in the mundane realities of the present, on takeoff, on landing, and in the moment it was forced to turn and fight. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was not so much defeated as it was systematically dismantled. Its ultimate failure was not a result of poor design, but rather the fatal convergence of its own inherent limitations with the ruthless, analytical efficiency of its American opponents. Their Achilles heel of the wonder weapon was not a single flaw, but a constellation of vulnerabilities, technical, logistical, and tactical, that Allied pilots learned to exploit with devastating precision. The jet's revolutionary power plant, the very source of its dominance, was also the root of its downfall. The most critical vulnerability was the Junkers Jumo 00 for turbojet engine itself. A masterpiece of engineering conceived under the severe material constraints of a failing Reich, it was fatally fragile. To conserve scarce strategic metals like nickel, cobalt, and molybdenum, the engines were constructed with substitute materials that could not withstand the extreme thermal and mechanical stresses for prolonged periods. The mean time between failures was a mere 10 to 25 flight hours. The compressor blades were prone to warping and fatigue, and the combustion chambers often cracked. A pilot could not simply slam the throttles forward. The engines were notoriously susceptible to compressor stalls and flameouts if accelerated too aggressively. This meant the Me-262 had an acceleration gap, a deadly several-second delay where it could not rapidly spool up to escape a threat. For an American pilot diving out of the sun, those few seconds were the difference between a missed opportunity and a kill. This mechanical temperamentality dictated a rigid and predictable flight profile that American fighters learned to anticipate. The jet's short endurance, typically around 60 minutes, created a tactical stopwatch on every mission. A pilot had to carefully manage his fuel, limiting his time in combat and ensuring a precise return to base. This knowledge allowed USAAF commanders to map the Me-262's operational patterns. They knew when and where the jets would be most active, and more importantly, when they would be forced to return, low on fuel and options. The most dangerous moments for a Me-262 pilot were the 10 minutes after takeoff and the 10 minutes before landing. During these phases, the aircraft was slow, heavy with fuel or configured with landing gear and flaps, and its pilot's attention was focused on the complex task of managing his temperamental engines rather than scanning the sky for threats. It was at these moments that the P-51 Mustangs would strike. American squadrons developed the tactic of loitering, or rat-catching, near known Me-262 airfields like Lechfeld and Parchim. Flying at high altitude to conserve fuel and avoid light flak, they would wait with the patience of predators. The sight of a jet lining up for its final approach, gears down and slowing to landing speed, was the signal to attack. The Mustangs would peel off into a high-speed dive, using gravity to augment their speed, and bounce the virtually defenseless jet. The Me-262 pilot, his airspeed bleeding off, had few options. He could try to jettison his landing gear and firewall the throttles, risking a flameout, or he could attempt a desperate, shallow turn, making himself an easy target. Many were shot down within sight of their own runways. Beyond the engine, the airframe itself presented vulnerabilities. The Me-262's nosewheel landing gear, while practical for ground handling, was weak and notoriously prone to collapse, especially on the rough, hastily repaired airstrips that were common in late-war Germany. This led to numerous operational losses without a single shot being fired. Furthermore, the aircraft's high landing speed, around 140 miles per hour, made every return to base a potential accident. The Allies understood that even if they couldn't shoot down every jet, they could attrite the force through these operational losses. Bombing raids specifically targeted jet production facilities and, just as importantly, the transportation networks delivering the precious Jumo 00 for engines from the factory to the airfields. The tactical exploitation extended to the jet's armament. The 430 million Malawian Quachars 108 cannons, while devastating, had a relatively low muzzle velocity and a steep trajectory. They were designed to obliterate large, slow-moving bombers at close range. Against a small, nimble, and aggressively flown P-51, they were far less effective. A Mustang pilot making a high deflection shot or a sharp brake turn could easily throw off the jet pilot's aim. The American .50 caliber machine guns, with their higher rate of fire and flatter trajectory, were better suited for the brief snapshots presented during a high-speed bounce on a maneuvering jet. Perhaps the most profound weakness was one of numbers and logistics. While the Mi-262 was a qualitative marvel, it was being thrown into a war of quantitative annihilation. German industry, hammered by round-the-clock bombing, could never produce enough jets, enough engines, or enough fuel to make a strategic difference. By contrast, the United States was producing P-51 Mustangs by the thousands. For every Mi-262 that sortied, there were a dozen or more Mustangs waiting for it. The Allied strategy was one of relentless pressure, knowing that the German jet force would eventually break under the strain of constant combat, mechanical failure, and a crippling lack of resources. The defeat of the Mi-262 was therefore a victory of system over singularity. The Americans exploited not just a single flaw, but every aspect of the weapons ecosystem, its fragile engines, its limited endurance, its vulnerable airfields, and its crippling logistical chain. They turned the jet's greatest strength, its speed, into a liability by forcing it into situations where that speed was nullified. The wonder weapon was ultimately grounded not just by enemy fighters, but by a lack of fuel, a lack of spare parts, and a lack of time. The Mi-262's Achilles heel was not a spot on its hull, but the crumbling industrial base of the Third Reich itself. The United States Army Air Forces did not defeat the Messerschmitt Mi-262 by building a faster fighter, they accomplished it by building a smarter trap. Faced with an enemy that existed in a different performance envelope, American pilots and tacticians were forced to abandon the classic dogfighting playbook and invent a new form of aerial combat, one based on geometry, psychology, and the ruthless exploitation of predictable behavior. The P-51 Mustang, the finest piston engine fighter of the war, became the key instrument in this new strategy, not by outperforming the jet, but by outthinking its pilots and systematically eliminating the conditions under which it could thrive. The foundational principle of the new tactics was energy management, but of a different kind. In a duel between equals, energy management is about conserving and exchanging speed and altitude. Against the Mi-262, it was about positional energy. Since the Mustang could not match the jet's kinetic energy, raw speed, it had to maximize its potential energy, altitude, to be converted into a lethal, diving attack. The standard doctrine became, altitude is life. Mustang squadrons assigned to bomber escort would stack their formations, with the highest flights, their top cover, patrolling thousands of feet above the bomber stream. From this heavenly perch, they possessed the ultimate tactical advantage, the ability to see without being easily seen, and to strike with the accumulated force of a dive. The most effective and psychologically devastating tactic developed was the rat scramble, or the deliberate ambushing of Mi-262s around their own airfields. American intelligence meticulously tracked the locations of jet bases. Knowing the Mi-262's short endurance created a predictable cycle of sorties, P-51 groups would dispatch fighter sweeps to loiter at high altitude near these fields, such as Lechfeld and Parchim. They would orbit just outside the range of light flak, invisible from the ground, their pilots' eyes fixed on the runways below. They were waiting for one of two moments. First, and most preferred, was the landing approach. A Mi-262 returning from a mission was at its absolute weakest. It was low on fuel, its pilot was likely fatigued, and the aircraft itself was slow, with landing gear and flaps deployed, creating immense drag. To a diving Mustang pilot, it was a near-stationary target. The attack was swift and merciless. A flight of P-51s would peel off from their orbit, nosing over into a steep dive that would push their airspeeds well past 400 miles per hour. They would make a single, slashing pass, pouring .50 caliber fire into their vulnerable jet before using their dive speed to climb back to safety. For the German pilot, the sight of Mustangs plummeting from the sky just as he was lining up for final approach was the stuff of nightmares. Second was the takeoff roll. The Mi-262's sluggish acceleration and long takeoff run made it vulnerable for a critical minute after it left the ground. It would be slow, heavy with fuel, and the pilot would be focused on raising the gear and managing the delicate engine throttles. A diving P-51 could catch it in this transient phase, before it could build up enough speed to escape. Beyond airfield ambushes, Mustang pilots developed sophisticated tactics for engaging jets in the vast arena of the sky. They learned never to try to turn with a Mi-262 from a position of energy parity. Instead, they employed hit-and-run tactics that mirrored, on a smaller scale, what the jet did to the bombers. A flight leader spotting a jet would not give chase directly. Instead, he would calculate an intercept course, anticipating where the jet would be in 30 seconds. He would then lead his flight in a shallow dive to build speed, aiming for a cutoff point ahead of the jet. The goal was not to chase from behind, but to slash across its flight path from the side or from a slight angle ahead, delivering a brief, devastating burst of gunfire in the fleeting second before the jet flashed past. This required incredible timing and marksmanship, but it was the only way to get a shooting solution without being left in the jet's wake. Another critical tactic was the use of their bait and switch. A lone, seemingly inattentive Mustang flying near the bomber stream would act as bait. Higher, hidden flights of P-51s would watch, hoping an overconfident Mi-262 pilot would take the lure and dive on the solitary fighter. The moment the jet committed to its attack and began its high-speed pass, it would temporarily enter a predictable flight path. The hidden top cover would then dive, not on the jet itself, but into a position to cut off its escape route. The jet pilot, having made his pass, would find himself climbing or turning directly into the guns of the waiting ambush. Communication and discipline were the glue that held these complex traps together. Radio discipline was paramount. A calm, clear call of "jets, 5 o'clock high, 2 miles," climbing from a top-cover pilot was worth more than a dozen frantic, uncoordinated warnings. Flight leaders drilled their pilots relentlessly on these new doctrines, emphasizing the need for patience over impetuosity. The glory-seeking lone wolf of the early war was a liability in this new environment. Success depended on coordinated, disciplined teamwork. The trap that was set for the Mi-262 was not one of steel, but of foresight and information. It was a web woven from the threads of the jet's own limitations, its short legs, its fragile engines, its predictable bases. The P-51 Mustang, operating from a position of superior numbers, better intelligence, and unparalleled range, became the master of this web. The American pilots learned to cede the domain of pure speed to the jet, while dominating the domains of position, timing, and tactical ingenuity. They proved that even in the jet age, the most powerful weapon was not always the fastest aircraft, but the cleverest mind in the cockpit. The myth of the Mi-262's invincibility was a carefully cultivated weapon in itself, a psychological shroud that preceded the aircraft into battle. For weeks, it had worked. The mere rumor of jets in the area sent jitters through bomber formations and put escort pilots on a hair trigger. The silver streaks that tore through the combat boxes, leaving shattered bombers in their wake, seemed less like machines and more like elemental forces, untouchable and merciless. This period of war, however, could not last. Every weapon, no matter how revolutionary, meets its moment of first contact, when theory collides with the chaotic reality of combat and its aura of invincibility is tested. For the Mi-262, that moment arrived on October 7, 1944, in the skies near Alkmaar, Germany. The architect of the myth-shattering was Lieutenant Urban L. Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group. Flying his P-51D Mustang, Detroit Miss, on a bomber escort mission to Berlin, Drew's flight was alerted to enemy aircraft in the vicinity. What happened next was not a classic, twisting dogfight. It was a perfect storm of opportunity, sharp eyes, and a jet pilot's momentary, fatal lapse in the one discipline that kept him safe, situational awareness. Drew spotted two Mi-262s flying low and slow, apparently preparing to land at their base at Alkmaar. They were in their most vulnerable state, gear down, flaps deployed, speed bled off, the pilot's attention focused on the runway ahead rather than the sky above and behind them. In that moment, the theoretical vulnerabilities that Allied pilots had been discussing in debriefing rooms became a tangible reality. The jet's speed was neutralized. Its acceleration was useless with its wheels down. It was a sitting duck. Drew nosed his Mustang over into a dive, converting his altitude into speed. He later recounted the surreal sight of the two jets, looking like a pair of slow-flying ducks. He lined up on the first, his K-14 gyroscopic gun sight computing the lead. A burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns walked into the Mi-262, which immediately belched smoke and crashed. The second jet pilot, finally aware of the threat, frantically tried to jettison his landing gear and apply power. But the Jumo 00 for engines had their characteristic lag. That 2-second delay was an eternity. Drew smoothly transitioned his aim, firing another sustained burst. The second Mi-262 shuddered, caught fire, and plowed into the ground. In less than a minute, the unthinkable had happened. A piston engine fighter had just destroyed two of the Reich's wonder weapons. The impact of Drew's double kill was seismic. The official report was initially met with disbelief at higher headquarters. The claim seemed too fantastic. But gun camera footage and corroborating witnesses confirmed the incredible feat. The news spread through Allied fighter squadrons like an electric current. The message was simple and profound: they can be killed. The psychological barrier was broken. The Mi-262 was not a ghost, it was an aircraft made of aluminum, steel, and flammable fuel, subject to the same laws of physics and ballistics as any other. For the German jet pilots, the loss was a chilling omen. The confident, almost arrogant sense of security they had felt in their high-speed mounts evaporated. They now knew that the Americans were not just running scared, they were learning, adapting, and hunting. The sky was no longer a safe place, even for them. Every landing approach, every takeoff, every moment spent at low speed became fraught with tension. The hunter now had to constantly look over its shoulder. Drew's victory was the first confirmed, but it was quickly followed by others as American pilots internalized the new tactics. Just a few weeks later, on November 8, 1944, Major Richard E. Connor of the 78th Fighter Group demonstrated that the jets could be killed in aerial combat, not just in their landing pattern. Engaging a Mi-262 during a dogfight, Connor used his Mustang's superior horizontal maneuverability. As the jet pilot made a climbing turn, Connor cut inside his turn radius, getting a brief snapshot with his .50 calibers. He scored hits on the jet's wing root, causing it to roll over and dive into the ground. This kill was perhaps even more significant than Drew's. It proved that even in its element, the sky, the Mi-262 could be outmaneuvered and defeated by a skilled pilot in a piston-engine fighter if the jet was forced to fight on the Mustang's terms. These early losses shattered the myth of invincibility and opened the floodgates. Their rat-catching tactics were validated. Pilots who had once felt a sense of helplessness now prowled the perimeters of German jet bases with renewed aggression. The Mi-262, for all its speed, was now trapped. To be effective, it had to fly from its bases, and those bases were now surrounded by invisible, high-altitude picket lines of P-51s and P-47s. The wonder weapon was being systematically cornered. The first blood drawn by Ben Drew was not an isolated incident, it was the first crack in a dam, and behind it was a tidal wave of American tactical ingenuity and overwhelming numbers that would soon overwhelm the German jet program. The era of war was over. The era of the hunt had begun. The shattering of the Mi-262's invincibility myth transformed the psychological landscape of the air war. What began with Lieutenant Drew's opportunistic ambush evolved into a systematic campaign of destruction, led by a new breed of hunter. These were the Mustang aces, men who had already mastered the art of killing Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, and who now applied their refined skills to the ultimate challenge, bagging a jet. Their successes were not mere luck, they were the product of supreme confidence, flawless tactical execution, and an intimate understanding that the sky itself could be weaponized against a faster foe. Among these masters, Captain Charles Chuck Yeager stood out. Already a decorated ace before his fateful encounter, Yeager embodied the cool, analytical approach that proved so lethal to the jets. On November 6, 1944, while leading a flight of P-51s from the 357th Fighter Group, Yeager spotted a Mi-262 far below, cruising at low altitude. Instead of diving immediately and alerting the German pilot, Yeager played a patient, calculating game. He kept his flight high, using the sun at his back to mask his approach. He watched the jet, studying its flight path, waiting for the perfect moment. He knew the jet pilot felt secure in his speed, a confidence that bred complacency. When the Mi-262 began a gentle turn, exposing its flank, Yeager made his move. He rolled his Mustang over and dove, not directly at the jet, but ahead of it, leading the target with geometric precision. He later recalled the sensation of the dive, the airframe shaking as he pushed the Mustang to its limits, not to catch the jet, but to intersect it. He fired a single, well-aimed burst from 600 yards. His .50 caliber shells tore into the jet's wing and fuselage. The Mi-262 pilot, likely never seeing his attacker, jettisoned his canopy and bailed out as his aircraft spun into the ground. For Yeager, it was a matter of physics and timing, not brute force. He had used the jet's own predictable speed against it, solving the problem of the intercept with the mind of an engineer. Just a few months later, on March 18, 1945, Major George E. Preddy, the USAAF's top Mustang ace, demonstrated a different facet of the hunter's skill set. Preddy, leading the 328th Fighter Squadron, was patrolling near Berlin when he was vectored towards incoming jets. What followed was a relentless, high-stakes pursuit. Preddy spotted a Mi-262 and initiated a dive from 20,000 feet. Unlike Yeager's ambush, this was a tail chase, the scenario that was supposed to be hopeless for a piston-engine fighter. But Preddy understood the Mi-262's weaknesses intimately. He knew that in a shallow dive, the performance gap between the Mustang and the jet narrowed significantly. He kept his throttle firewalled, his eyes locked on the target, slowly closing the distance as they streaked across the German countryside at treetop level. The German pilot, realizing he was being caught, began a gentle weaving maneuver, but it was not enough. Preddy's relentless pressure paid off. At extreme range, he opened fire, his traces finally walking into the jet's right engine. A stream of smoke and flame erupted, and the Mi-262 crashed into a forest. Preddy's victory was a testament to sheer determination and the Mustang's ability to sustain high speed in a dive, proving that even a tail chase was not impossible if the pilot had the nerve to see it through. These aces developed a shared doctrine for killing jets, a set of principles that were disseminated throughout the fighter groups. First was altitude is life. They never engaged a jet from a position of equal or lower altitude. Their bounce from above was their primary weapon, converting potential energy into the kinetic energy needed for a single, decisive pass. Second was the unseen kill. The ideal attack was one where the jet pilot never saw his attacker. This meant using clouds for concealment, attacking out of the sun, or, as Yeager did, waiting for the moment the German pilot's attention was diverted. Surprise was the great equalizer. Third was exploit the transition. The masters of the kill were experts at attacking during the jet's moments of vulnerability. Climbing after takeoff, maneuvering to line up on a bomber, or, most lethally, slowing to land. They knew the jet's cockpit was a busy place, and they struck when its pilot was most task-saturated. The impact of these aces went far beyond their individual kill tallies. They were living proof that pilot skill and tactical innovation could bridge a technological chasm. Their victories, celebrated and studied, created a culture of aggressive confidence within the Mustang squadrons. The Mi-262 was no longer a terror, it was a trophy. The competitive spirit among aces now included a new and coveted category, jet killer. This shift in mentality was as devastating to the Luftwaffe as the physical losses. A German jet pilot could no longer assume his speed was a guaranteed escape. He now had to fly defensively, constantly checking his 6 o'clock high, nervously eyeing every speck in the sky. This defensive posture sapped their aggressiveness, limited their effectiveness against the bombers, and increased their fuel consumption. The masters of the kill in their Mustangs had not only learned how to shoot down jets, they had learned how to psychologically ground them. They turned the Mi-262 from a war-winning wonder weapon into a hunted animal, and in doing so, they secured the skies for the bombers that were systematically dismantling the Reich from above. The age of the piston engine ace ended not with a whimper, but with their greatest triumph, the taming of the first jet. The high-altitude duel between a diving Mustang and a cruising Mi-262 was a contest of geometry and nerves. But the most lethal, and psychologically devastating, form of combat against the German jets was far more intimate. It was the ambush, a tactic that ruthlessly exploited the moments when the futuristic war machine was reduced to its most mundane and vulnerable self. For the American fighter pilots, the jet's greatest weakness was not in the air, but in its inescapable tether to the ground. They learned that to kill a predator, one did not need to outrun it, one simply needed to wait at its den. This doctrine of ambush crystallized into a formalized tactic known as field circling or rat catching. It was a mission of patience and precision, a deliberate hunting strategy that targeted the Mi-262 not as a flying weapon, but as a logistical entity. USAAF intelligence painstakingly identified and monitored known jet bases, such as Lechfeld, Parchim, and Brandenburg-Brest. Using photo reconnaissance and signals intelligence, they built a picture of the jet's operational rhythms, when they sortied, when they returned, and their standard traffic patterns. Armed with this knowledge, flights of P-51s and P-47s were dispatched not to roam the bomber streams, but to loiter with predatory intent in the airspace surrounding these bases. They would climb to high altitude, 25,000 feet or more, positioning themselves up sun and just outside the effective range of the German flak batteries. From this vantage point, they were nearly invisible to the ground. Below them, the airfield lay exposed like a diagram, its runways, taxiways, and dispersal pens clearly visible. The American pilots would cut their engines to idle, conserving fuel, and begin their silent, orbiting vigil. They were hunters in a blind, waiting for their quarry to appear. The most productive moment for the ambush was, without question, the landing approach. A Mi-262 returning from a combat mission was a machine stripped of its advantages. It was low on fuel, its pilot was likely fatigued from the intense concentration of high-speed combat, and the aircraft itself was transitioning from a sleek dart into a clumsy, configured airframe. The pilot would begin his descent, lowering his landing gear and flaps, each action adding drag and bleeding away his precious airspeed. His focus would narrow to the runway ahead, the instrument panel, and the complex task of managing his temperamental jet engines at low power settings. His head was down, his situational awareness collapsing to the confines of the traffic pattern. It was at this moment, when the jet was slow, low, and its pilot's attention was monopolized by the landing ritual, that the trap would be sprung. A calm, terse radio call would break the silence in the American flight, bandit, on final. Going down. A two-ship element, or sometimes an entire flight, would peel off from a high orbit. They would roll inverted and pull their aircraft into a near-vertical dive, the rush of air building to a scream as their airspeed indicators wound past 400, then 450 miles per hour. The dive was not just for speed, it was for shock. The sight of Mustangs plummeting from the zenith like avenging angels was designed to induce panic. The attack was a swift, violent pass. There was no dogfight. The diving fighter would line up from behind and slightly above, the massive, slow-moving jet filling his gun sight. A short, concentrated burst from 6 or 8.50 caliber machine guns would rip into the Mi-262's fuselage, wings, or, most catastrophically, its fuel-laden wings or jettisonable landing gear. The results were often instantaneous and horrific. A jet would stagger, belch smoke and flame, and cartwheel into the ground just short of the runway. Sometimes, the pilot would have a split second to jettison his canopy and leap out, his parachute barely having time to open. The psychological impact on the German ground crews and other pilots waiting to land was immeasurable. To see their prized wonder weapon destroyed in sight of safety shattered morale in a way that a loss over distant Berlin never could. The takeoff roll was the second most vulnerable phase. A heavily laden Mi-262 required a long, slow acceleration run. As it lumbered down the runway, fighting to become airborne, it was a sitting duck. A diving P-51 could make a single strafing pass, its bullets chewing up the concrete around the jet and walking into its vulnerable airframe before it could rotate. These attacks were so feared that German airfield commanders began deploying rings of anti-aircraft guns and positioning Focke-Wulf 190s on standing patrols to protect the jets during these critical minutes. But this itself was a victory for the Allies, diverting precious resources and further complicating German operations. The success of the ambush tactic was a testament to a fundamental truth the Americans had grasped: technological superiority is contextual. The Mi-262 was invincible in the realm of high-speed, high-altitude flight. But it was profoundly mortal in the slow, dirty, and predictable world of takeoffs and landings. By shifting the battle to this domain, the USAAF negated the jet's greatest assets. They turned the Mi-262's own operational necessities, its need to refuel, rearm, and rest its pilots, into a lethal liability. The element of surprise, wielded with cold, patient calculation from 25,000 feet above, proved to be the most effective countermeasure to raw speed. The Hunter, forced to return to its lair, was being slaughtered on its own doorstep. The confrontation between the P-51 Mustang and the Mi-262 Schwalbe stands as one of history's most compelling military paradoxes. The clear technological superior was defeated, not by a better machine, but by a better system. The legacy of their encounter is not a simple story of propeller versus jet, it is a timeless lesson in the complex algebra of warfare, where technology is merely one variable in an equation that includes production, logistics, training, tactics, and strategic vision. The propellers did not defeat the jet in a straight fight, they defeated it by ensuring the fight was never straight. At its core, the Mi-262 was a weapon of tactical brilliance but strategic poverty. It was born from a regime in its death throes, a desperate gambit to reverse an already lost war through a technological wonder weapon. This context dictated its every characteristic and its every flaw. The Jumo 00 for engines, revolutionary in concept, were crippled by the lack of strategic materials, leading to tragically short service lives and profound unreliability. Its production was scattered, hidden, and constantly disrupted by the very Allied bombing campaigns it was designed to stop. Its pilots, though often highly skilled, were rushed through training, and their numbers were a tiny fraction of the endless stream of American and British airmen. The jet was a masterpiece, but it was a masterpiece produced by a collapsing artist. The P-51 Mustang, by contrast, was the ultimate expression of a healthy, thriving military-industrial ecosystem. It was not a desperate gamble, but the refined product of incremental improvement and vast resources. Its Packard Merlin engine was a paragon of reliability, produced in the tens of thousands. Its airframes rolled off assembly lines in Inglewood and Dallas by the thousands, untouched by enemy bombs. Its pilots received extensive, systematic training. The Mustang was not a singular wonder, it was a standardized, mass-produced tool, and therein lay its strength. The numerical disparity was staggering. While the Germans built roughly 1,400 Mi-262s, the Americans produced over 15,000 P-51s. The Allies could absorb losses, the Luftwaffe could not. This strategic divergence manifested in the tactical realm. The Mi-262's short endurance and mechanical fragility created predictable patterns. It was tethered to its bases, and its operations were governed by a stopwatch. The Americans, with their superior intelligence and numerical advantage, learned to exploit this ruthlessly. They turned the jet's greatest asset, its speed, into a liability by forcing it into combat phases where that speed was nullified, during takeoff and landing. Their rat-catching tactics were not a brilliant innovation born of genius, but a logical, systemic response to an observable weakness. They were the product of a learning organization that could rapidly disseminate lessons learned from debriefings and translate them into effective combat doctrine. Furthermore, the American strategy of overarching air superiority meant that the Mi-262 was never just fighting Mustangs. It was fighting a network. The bombers themselves were the bait and the strategic objective. The high-altitude escort Mustangs were the anvil, blocking the jet's easiest path to the bombers. The low-level rat patrols were the hammer, waiting to crush the jets at their bases. This integrated system meant the Mi-262 pilot could never simply engage in a pure, one-on-one duel where his technology could shine. He was constantly maneuvering within a kill box designed by his enemy. The legacy of this encounter fundamentally shaped post-war military philosophy, particularly in the United States. It provided a powerful, real-world cautionary tale against over-reliance on silver bullet technologies. The lesson was clear: a revolutionary weapon, no matter how potent, is useless without a robust industrial base to produce it, a reliable logistical system to sustain it, a well-trained corps of operators to employ it, and a sound strategy to integrate it. This lesson echoed through the Cold War, informing the US approach to everything from nuclear missiles to stealth aircraft, where the platform itself was always understood to be just one node in a vast, supporting network. For the Germans, the Me-262 was a tragic glimpse of a future they would not inhabit. It pointed the way to the jet age that would dawn just years later, but its own story was one of wasted potential. Hamstrung by Hitler's insistence on using it as a bomber, delayed by bureaucratic inertia, and ultimately starved of the resources needed to succeed, it became a symbol of brilliant innovation crushed by systemic failure. In the end, the propeller defeated the jet by winning the war that was actually being fought, not the war the German engineers wished they were fighting. The P-51 and its pilots excelled in the war of attrition, of production figures, of fuel supplies, of training hours, and of tactical adaptability. The Me-262 was designed to win dogfights, but the Allies had made dogfighting irrelevant. They had created a system where the outcome was decided long before the aircraft ever met in the sky, in the factories of Michigan, the oil fields of Texas, and the training schools of Arizona. The legacy of their encounter is a permanent reminder that in the calculus of conflict, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts, and that the most advanced technology, in isolation, is no guarantee of victory.